welcome again to the Property Hustle Podcast, where we do real talk on owning, renting, and investing in Nigeria's real estate in such a way that it makes it easier to make smarter and safer decisions. And in today's episode, I want us to talk about some shocking realities around accommodation rentals in Nigeria that look so unreal when you hear them. One of these points I want to make in this episode is tenancy agreement. You observe that a lot of tenants in Nigeria don't read tenancy agreement. They don't. Maybe it's because of poor reading culture, because, as they said, rather, that if you want to hide something from a Nigerian, you should put it inside a book, because we may never read it, actually because of the poor reading culture, although I believe there are improvements these days. And then I think the second part of this reason why you are not going to even blame the tenants so much, why they are not reading the tenancy agreement, is because tenancy agreement most of the time comes after the payment for the rent has already been made. And so at that point in time, the tenant doesn't even have the time to sit and say, okay, let me read this agreement again. Or maybe the tenant might even feel that reading it at that point might not really be necessary because already the payment is made. And if there's anything in the clause of the agreement, rather of the tenancy agreement document, that the tenant doesn't really flow with, or that does not sit well with the tenant, at that point, it might even be difficult to recall it or to settle it with the landlord. So I think it's high time we normalize landlord bringing up tenancy agreements so that the tenant can see it and read it before the payment is made. And in fact, in some cases, the tenancy agreement are not even presented. The landlord doesn't give tenancy agreement. So it's difficult for the tenant to know the terms and conditions and the do's and the don'ts pertaining to the rentals. Because at the end of the day, it's inside the tenancy agreement that you get to know, okay, these are your responsibilities as the tenant and these are the responsibility of the landlord. So that in the future, if there's anything to be done, you know, okay, this is the one I'm supposed to do and this is the one the landlord is supposed to do. So that is one of the realities in the rental market, the rental space in Nigeria. That is, to me, I think is shocking. But you tell me what you think about this. And then the next point I want to talk about is the fact that some tenants can sue their way into staying in the landlord property for endless time, for a very, very long time without paying the rent. And how do they do it? They employ the instrument of the law, right? For instance, if the tenant is not paying rent and the landlord now decides to maybe give quit notice, or try to get the money for the rent, the tenant might not really bring the money on time, and at the end of the day, it leads to maybe some misunderstanding. And the next thing you hear is that the tenant has sued the landlord. So it's not even like the landlord that owned the house that sued the tenant. So tenants sue the landlord. So that happens especially in cities like Abuja here, maybe like Lagos, where you have a lot of people that know a lot of things, because they feel like even though it's your property, I have my right. So maybe sometimes it could even be as a result of some statements or some comments that you make to them that annoys them and they want to kind of deal with you. And at other times, it could be the responsibility or the fault of the landlord. Maybe there are some maintenance that are supposed to be done that the tenant maybe has been talking about it for so many time and it's not being done. And so the tenant might decide that, okay, this is my own time to deal with you. So you find that very, very common in Nigeria, especially in Abuja, right? That tenants, even though they don't own the house, it's not their house, they sue the landlord to enforce their right or to make sure that they stay in the property without paying. And that happens a lot. For instance, there's an incident that a friend of mine told me, who happens to be a caretaker for a property somewhere around Abuja here. And then he says that one of the tenants in that property is not paying the rent. And the tenant did not just stop at not paying the rent. He sued them to court. And so by suing them to court, they were in the court for so many years, for 1 year, 2 years and going. And I was asking, so how about the rent? Is he paying the rent? And he told me no, that he's not paying the rent because the case is still in court. And so he is able to stay in the house without paying the rent. So this happens a lot in Nigeria, especially in the urban centers like Abuja. And then you now have caution deposit. So caution deposit is not like something you pay and it's gone. It is supposed to be a refundable deposit that you make to the landlord, so that in the event that maybe something goes wrong or something spoils in the property, when you are leaving that property, the landlord can use that money to now solve those problems. And this still kind of goes back to the first point I was making earlier about tenancy agreement. You know, in the tenancy agreement, ideally it's stipulated like you know your own responsibility as the tenant and the responsibility of the landlord. So you know the things that you are supposed to fix when they spoil as you live in that house, or the things that the landlord is supposed to fix, the major things that the landlord are supposed to fix. So that when it now comes to the time that you are leaving and you've deposited the caution deposit already, you will know, okay, among the list of the things I was supposed to do, I did them as the tenant. And so my caution deposit should be intact. But in most cases, caution deposits are rarely paid back to the tenant in Nigeria. Sometimes as a result of the fact that the tenant is not aware of the things that are his responsibility. And so the system or the landlord or the landlord's representative might use that against him. And so the caution deposits are never returned. And in some cases, you are leaving that property maybe not in a very good time. Maybe there's a misunderstanding between you and the landlord. And so the caution deposit discussion, it now becomes completely non-existent. And so your caution deposit that you drop down is rarely returned. Although I'm not saying it's in all cases. There are some cases that the caution deposit are still returned, but in rare occasions. Sometimes it could even be from the tenant, that maybe the tenant has got another accommodation, maybe as a result of misunderstanding with the current landlord, and is moving. And at that point in time, the tenant is just busy with the moving and all of that. And so caution deposits are rarely returned. That is another reality in the rental space in Nigeria, especially in the urban centers. And another thing again to talk about in this is about maintenance culture among the landlords. You know, landlords most of the time, they don't even want to do maintenance. What they prefer is you that is a tenant, you should do all the maintenance and then let them just collect all the rent. And so the maintenance culture among the landlords in Nigeria is very, very poor, and it needs to be, to improve. But that is the reality. You know, like for instance, I used to have a landlord that uh, the doors that were in the house, which of course should be a major maintenance that is supposed to be within the purview of the landlord. The landlord should be able to fix those ones. So the doors were having problem. You know, it's all these olden days doors and all these wooden doors, and they have shrinked, and some of them has even like broken. You see that some part of it, you like, for instance, doors to the toilet. You can be in the room and then you are seeing part of the toilet. And so when somebody is in the toilet, you know, the smell and stuff can return back to the room. And so I told the man that, okay, please, there's a problem with these doors and they need to be fixed. Of course, the door were almost like that before I packed in, and I was expecting that, okay, with time that he's going to do those fixes, but he never did. So I now told him, okay, let's do these fixes. And this even coincided with the time that he was trying to increase the rent, or he increased the rent, right? And so I now saw it as an opportunity to now get him to do those fixes. And I told him, sir, these doors, please, you should try to do something about it. Even if it's not all of the doors, maybe you do the entrance door and some other doors. But he told me, Idris, are you expecting me to fix the doors for you? And so it got me wondering, if you are not fixing the door for me, should I use my money to fix the door? It is your house. The house is not mine. So at the end of the day, even though you've given your house to a tenant as a landlord, the house is still your own. The house still belongs to you. The tenant is just going to live there just for a while and move out. So all this major maintenance needs to be done. And so as a landlord, the maintenance culture is lacking and it needs to improve. And so that is one of the realities of the rental industry or the rental space in Nigeria, is that the maintenance culture among the landlord is very, very poor, is lacking. Most of the landlord, they don't even want to do maintenance. They want you, the tenant, to be the one to do all the maintenance and still pay the rent. You understand? So that is one of the realities. And then you now have this issue of when the landlord is not fixing the house, right? The landlord is not doing the maintenance. But now, if you as the tenant now decides that, okay, this house I have rented, I want it to be to my taste. I want it in a certain way, like it's not standard to my liking. I want to improve on it. So you now commit your money and your resources, your energy to now do these renovations. You fix the house, you probably do screeding, painting, do some other things, some other major overhaul, and the house becomes very standard to your taste. In some cases, right, that could be the reason why you get a quick notice from the landlord. Not because by fixing the house you've done the wrong thing, but because maybe the landlord, that is some dubious landlord, are already thinking of how to take maximum advantage of what you've done with your own money. It's not their own money that you used. And so they think that if you are out of that house with that fixes, with those renovations that you've done, the value of the house can be higher for them, especially in the urban centers, because it's urban centers that you find a lot of things. If it's in the village, who cares? You just rent and you stay and everything goes smoothly. But in the urban center, it's more like survival of the fittest. So a lot of people, they employ some tactics and try to outsmart other people. Some person they just want to be smart, right? So this is one of the realities, that sometimes you fix the accommodation as a tenant, and that becomes the reason why you get a quick notice to leave the house. And so that is why somebody will say, if you are going to put your money to fix an accommodation that is not your own, a property that is not your own, that you should calculate very well. You should calculate your losses. In fact, you should know that this is a loss for me. Like, for instance, I committed money. I rented an accommodation, like an office accommodation. The office, we were before we came here. I committed a lot of money to fix the property, right? Because what they handed to me was more like a shell. It was just the space, and it wasn't to my taste. It wasn't what I thought was ideal for an office space. So I committed a lot of money to fix it. And then 2 years down the line, they came up and said they want to convert the plaza to a hotel. Of course, at a point, I knew that this wasn't the case. It was a case of they wanted to recover, or like to increase the rents exorbitantly, and which actually is what they ended up doing. And so, but by that time, I had already committed a lot of money. Some of them had even entered my office. They've seen how, I've tried, how I've put the office together. And so they chase out every other person. And because I noticed the body language, that this might not actually be connected to either changing the use of the property, that it's about increasing the rent. So I now met with the caretaker. So I now said, okay, madam, see this. If the point is to increase the rent, I think I should be able to still kind of stay along, because what I was thinking in my head that time was that the fact that I have already committed a lot of money to fix this office, right? And so if I am going to another place and starting over again, I'm going to spend more money again, because obviously there's no way just getting a space will be enough, because we have different uh, preference for how we want to arrange our spaces, how we want the space to look, and all of that. So I approached them, and they agreed. They say, okay, no problem, you can remain. When it comes to time that we're fixing the new rent, we'll inform you. And so they informed me, and obviously the increase was just exorbitant. Just imagine increasing rent by like 300%. It's just too exorbitant. So at that point, I could not afford that. And it did not even make any sense to me, because I was also asked to pay agency fee and legal fee again. And I was asked to pay 2 years upfront, despite the fact that I had lived in this property. I had used this property for 2 years, So I had to vacate. Now, in vacating, what I actually sensed at the end of the day was like, the rental cost might not have actually been up to the amount that they presented to me, but they presented that so that I can leave, because they know if they increase 300%, 400%, there's no way, there's no anybody that will just see something just increase from like 1.5 million all the way to 6 million, and then you take it, right? Or to 3 million to 4.5 million, and you take it. So they knew I was going to leave. And so what I felt was that they wanted to take advantage of the fact that I had put the office in place. And so they wanted to see that they collect more money from the next person that is going to enter the office. So most of the time when you commit your money to fix a space, whether residential accommodation or office accommodation, it doesn't always maybe get sustainable, right? Because sometimes you can be chased out in the next year, in the following year, and then all the money you've spent has gone. And so you start all over again. So it's good to calculate. But these are some of the realities. This is part of the realities of the housing industry in Nigeria. And then the last but not the least is about agency fee. What I've noticed, or from the information available to me, a lot of landlords these days are telling the agents that they are not paying them agency fee. I remember in those days, it used to be like the tenant is paying the agency fee to the agent, and the landlord is paying the fee to the agent as well. But these days, it's no longer like that. And so you now see that the burden has now remained only on the tenant. That the agency fee now, instead of something that used to be 5% back in the days, now you have 10%, 15%. In some places, it's even up to 20%. In places like Lagos now, for instance, just to rent an accommodation that maybe costs like 1 million naira only, you end up spending close to 2 million naira or even more, thanks to the agency fee, the legal fee, and all those exorbitant fees that they calculate and give you to pay. So only the tenants these days pays the agent. The landlord doesn't pay. And in fact, in some very, very extreme cases, very, very shocking cases, some landlords even want to collect the agency fee as well with the agent. And so if a landlord called an agent or engaged an agent to get a tenant for the property, they will tell the agent, okay, I'm collecting the agency fee. And so now, instead of maybe the agent collecting or charging the tenant 5% for agency fee, they end up charging 10%, 15%. And they're charging that high because those landlords want to have a stake in the agency fee again. So they're collecting the rent, they're collecting the agency fee, they're collecting the rental fee. So all is part of the package that goes to the landlord. That is some landlord, not all the landlords. And so you have this case where only the tenants rather, pays agency fee. And that increases the cost for the tenant. Because at the end of the day, the cost of accommodation at present, as we know it, is just increasing and it's not stopping. Because you see an accommodation that cost maybe like 2 million last year. Today, if you are going to rent that same accommodation now, they are calling 4 million, they are calling 6 million. So what has happened? And it's not like maybe they have rebuilt the house or maybe they've renovated the house and all that, but the costs keep increasing. So these are some of these realities, some, I think, shocking realities in the housing industry, in the rental market in Nigeria that I want us to look at. So continuing on the rundown of what we've covered in this episode. We've talked about the tenancy agreement, the culture of not reading, the timing that the tenancy agreement comes. We've talked about some tenants suing their way to staying in the landlord's property unnecessarily for a very long time using the instrument of the law. We've talked about quit notice, right? We've talked about how some tenants, they don't take quit notice seriously. That in fact, some of them, they want you to bring it like right now because it gives them the time, the opportunity to delay, to buy more time, and some of them to even prepare their legal brief to sue you as the landlord. And then we've talked about the caution fee, how the caution fee is rarely returned, right? Because of still connected to the tenancy agreement, the fact that most tenants, they don't even know what are their responsibilities in the house as they live in the house. And so at the end of the day, the landlords might now have the instrument to kind of justify why the caution deposit will not be returned. And in some cases, the tenant doesn't even have the time to claim it. And so time comes, you leave and you move to another place. So caution deposit is rarely returned. And so I think there's a need for a rethink on how the caution deposit are structured, right? And then we've also talked about the maintenance culture among the landlords, right? That most landlords, they want you, the tenant, to be the one to carry out maintenance on the property that is not your own. You only rent it just for a while. And so that maintenance culture, it needs to change. We've talked about that. Then we'll talk about the fact that sometimes, even though the landlord, they've refused to maybe do the maintenance, and of course, they can still be increasing the rent, even though they've not done the maintenance. Maybe just because they saw that there are neighboring properties that they're increasing the rent. Meanwhile, those people have done maintenance or they've even rebuilt the property. So now this point is, even though the landlord has failed to do their own part and you, the tenant, decides to do it, to do maintenance, to put the house in shape, to your taste, at some point, it could just be a reason why you get a quit notice to leave the house. Because some landlords, the dubious landlords, some of them might want to take advantage of what you've done and then collect more money from another tenant that they might decide to put in. So when you are spending money on fixing the house that you rented as a tenant, you need to calculate. You need to decide whether these losses are worth it or not, so that at the end of the day, you not get like maybe angry, get disappointed in the system. But these are the things, these are realities. These are the things that happens. You understand? And then the last but not the least that we talked about was agency fee. How only the tenants pays the agency fee. You understand? The landlord doesn't pay. And in fact, in some extreme cases, how some landlords even tell the agents that they are collecting the agency fee, the legal fee, and everything, all the fees. They don't have a lawyer. They don't. And it's those landlords, actually, surprisingly, that don't even give a tenancy agreement. So they set their own rules. They can break their own rules. They can set any rules. They can change the rules at will. And so those are the things that I feel are some shocking realities in the rental industry or in the rental space in Nigeria, especially in the urban centers in Nigeria, that needs to kind of have an overhaul, like we need to look at going forward. And so we've come to the end of episode 2, and I hope you enjoyed listening to this. And I also welcome your contribution on this point, on these shocking realities, because this, of course, is not exhaustible. It's not something that maybe is a fixed list. No, it's not like that. There are other things that I have not put in this, and I want to implore you to comment those below so that let's continue the conversation. And I'll see you in the next one. Thank you for listening.